in the other off seasons, so the summer and the fall. And that terrestrial habitat is important for other types of species, from bear, large bear, moose, turkeys, to ducks and owls. So again, the vernal pool itself is important to the amphibians for breeding, and then the terrestrial upland habitat is important for those species as well as other species who are outside of the pool. So where are these vernal pools located? Well, you can't really see this map very well, but you have the map in your packet, and this shows that growth area. Oh, okay, thank you. The growth area as defined by the comprehensive plan, as well as the rural area as defined by the comprehensive plan. And hopefully you can see that the vernal pools are scattered throughout the entire town, within both the growth area and the rural area of town. And again, this was part of that mapping effort that went out a few years back, where they flew imagery, and out of the imagery there were select locations that looked like there could be vernal pools in those locations. So those were flagged, those properties were flagged, and landowners were notified. Citizen scientists were trained by scientists at the University of Maine to be able to go and identify and verify the location of the vernal pools. Again, it wasn't completely comprehensive, because you can miss vernal pools with the flyover of the aerial imagery, and also there were some landowners that didn't want people to go on their property, and so those pools were not verified. So there are current regulations surrounding vernal pools in terms of limitations on development. The federal regulations limit development within 750 feet of a vernal pool. This is defined by the Army Corps of Engineers, so they're the regulating body at the federal level, and they have the ability to enforce the 750-foot buffer rule through the Clean Water Act. The catch here is that the vernal pool needs to be part of a greater wetland system, and it needs to also be classified as a water of the United States for the Army Corps to step in and regulate. At the state level, the Maine Department of Environmental Protection, through the Natural Resources Protection Act, which we all know as NERPA, they're able to regulate up to 250 feet surrounding a vernal pool, but there has to be, they have to be classified as a significant vernal pool. And to be classified as a significant vernal pool, there are several criteria, and one of which is they have to find significant amounts of egg breeding masses within the pool, which is difficult because, like I said, the amphibians only go to breed in the spring. And so if they go do their site visits in the winter, summer, or fall, they're not going to find what they're looking for to classify this as a significant vernal pool. So there's a little bit of timing issues here. Also, scientists have found that while it might not be a significant vernal pool one year, the following year it could be significant. So really the staff time that it takes to go out and determine significant vernal pools at the state level, it's just not there. So we don't know if, this really is a significant or non-significant vernal pool, and those are only the ones that are protected through this 250-foot buffer at the state level. So this is there are limitations to the current regulation. So here we see the slide with the 250-foot buffer, and we see the amphibians sort of not caring about a buffer, and that's because they travel throughout the entire habitat. So you're not really protecting the vernal pool itself by regulating up to 250 feet. The animals need much more space than that to survive and to be prosperous into the future. Also, regulating at a buffer level of 250 and 750 feet creates this isolation. So you can develop right up to that 250-foot buffer line, right up to the 750-foot buffer line. What that does over time is the pool becomes isolated, the amphibians aren't able to travel outside of that area, and there becomes interbreeding. And interbreeding over time will cause the pool to die off. It won't be prosperous into the future. What needs to happen is for the juveniles from these pools to be able to go and colonize other pools throughout the entire landscape in order to make new pools prosperous, and for that pool to also be prosperous. So from a scientific perspective, the 250-foot and 750-foot buffer is not really protecting the pools at that level. It's small-scale protection, but in terms of vernal pools, they need a landscape scale, larger size protection to be able to have these vernal pools be successful into the future. From a socioeconomic standpoint, what this does is landowners within the designated development area, which is where, or the growth area, which is where the town, through the comprehensive plan, has said they want to target growth close to schools, close to amenities, close to utilities. They're smaller lots, and if you have to abide by a 250-foot or 750-foot regulation, really that cuts your lot size down even further, and so you really don't get a good return on investment if you're trying to develop within the area of town where we're trying to promote if you run into a vernal pool. There's also this issue of unpredictability for developers. Like I said, we don't know 100% where all the vernal pools are, and so a lot of times if there's a landowner who wants to have a project, a development within the designated development area, and they go and they do a wetlands analysis of the property, sometimes they can run into vernal pools, and then the project either doesn't go forward, or they get really far into it and spend a lot of money, and the project ends up not going forward because they cannot meet the regulations. So this leads me to the alternative vernal pool regulation. So a few years back, there was basically a consensus by scientists and the town, people at the town level, developers, people in the real estate market, that there needs to be some sort of new tool to be able to regulate vernal pools, where it could be a win-win situation, where the town could have development where they want to in growth areas, where developers wouldn't run into these unpredictable issues that they were running into, and where vernal pools could be protected at a larger scale level than they were being protected previously through the other regulation. So regulators, everyone got together and they developed an alternative regulation to vernal pools, and the way that they did that was through a special area management plan. And the special area management plan defines some criteria that municipalities would have to go through in order to then become the people who are now designated to permit, to provide a permit for vernal pools. And so I'll explain this a little bit more detail. Really, what it would allow for is that a landowner within the designated development area would be able to develop right up to a vernal pool, through the vernal pool, really get rid of the vernal pool and pretend that it wasn't even there and develop their project, as long as they were able to conserve 2 vernal pools and 70 acres within the rural area of town. So it would be a trade-off. It would be sort of a mitigation for being able to develop in the area that the town wants to develop in, and then to protect the vernal pools at a level where they would be prosperous into the future. So I went through this before, but some of the benefits of this alternative is that it would give certainty and predictability for applicants, developers, landowners within the growth area. It would be a municipal tool encouraging compact development within the growth area. It would provide economic incentive for development where municipalities want development. It would allow, again, to conserve vernal pools at a landscape larger scale in the rural area. It supports our town's vision for rural lands, so, you know, not sprawling with subdivisions, but, you know, more conserved land, open space. And it would also provide some incentive for rural landowners who, if they do put their land in conservation, that they could get some sort of tax break, or they would get money for land that they wouldn't have developed anyways because it's backland or it's wetland, or you know, some sort of example like that. So I'm just going to go through this quickly. There has to be some municipal criteria in place. And so that criteria includes an adopted comprehensive plan, which the town of Orono has, and that's necessary to define the growth area and also the rural area. And again, here's this map shows the growth area and the rural area, and it also shows what's known as a designated development area. The designated development area is a smaller portion of the growth area. It was designed for places that are on sewer and water, that have accessibility to main roads, and that would be prime targets for development in the future. So let me go back. There also has to be a signed agreement with a third-party nonprofit land conservation organization. Again, we talked about this last time, but we are in talks with the Orono Land Trust being that third party. And there has to be adopted ordinance language, and that's what is in front of you tonight, is the proposed ordinance language that would allow for the town to permit the vernal pool permits. So after all the criteria is in place, we are then able to request partial delegated authority from the Board of Environmental Protection at the state level to issue permits. And then after that, so the ordinance is in place, we have partial delegated authority, then the applicant would be, an applicant or a developer would be able to use this tool in development. And I threw this slide in this time because I think it's important for the planning board to understand what this would mean for you. And what it would mean is that within your site plan review or your subdivision plan review application, you would get a copy of the permit that was given by the code enforcement officer, and a receipt of the payment submitted to the code enforcement officer for the fee that would be put toward the mitigation action. So if that was basically the fee, which we talked about last time a lot, would be based on, you would either have the cost of the price of the land with the vernal pool subtracted from the price of the land without the vernal pool, and then it would be a 40% of that. Then we spoke about a minimum fee. So if the project isn't large enough to generate enough money to actually have some sort of a conservation action, acquisition of land in the rural area, that would amount to 2 vernal pools plus 70 acres being able to be conserved, then we would have a minimum fee in place. We are still in the talks of setting that minimum fee, but in the proposed amendment that you have in front of you tonight, page 3 and page 4 was amended since the last meeting to include some language to create a mechanism to create that minimum fee. It would be included into the fee schedule that the council adopts every year. And so that is included now within the ordinance as a mechanism to set up the minimum fee. We haven't 100% agreed on what the minimum fee would be yet, but we are working on it. And there's also language in the proposed ordinance now that ensures that the land trust would get the amount of money necessary to cover their administrative fees through that minimum fee.
Right, so all the planning board needs to know is that there's the mechanism in place. It's up to the council to decide what that fee structure. So we're not going there this evening.
Exactly, yes. So you would receive in your planning board packet notice that the applicant is choosing to utilize the Vernal Pool Overlay District tool, that they have met all the criteria necessary, that they've gone to the code enforcement officer, that they've gotten their permit, and that they've paid their fee. There's also this idea that the applicant could go out and purchase their own land, 70 acres plus 2 vernal pools in the rural area. And if they chose to go that route instead of paying the actual fee, they would have to show that they had title right or interest in the property that they purchased for the mitigation. And that conservation action that they take, so if they, let's say they went out and they purchased 70 acres, the third party or the land trust would have to verify that what the land that they purchased actually meets the criteria necessary to be the mitigation land. And I just want to remind you that the applicant can always choose to go with the current regulation at the state or federal level now. So the 250-foot buffer or the 750-foot buffer from the vernal pool. Mm-hmm. They don't have to use this. This is just an incentive to try and get development within the growth area. Mm-hmm. And as always, all other permits at the local, state, and federal level are still required. So again, once the applicant chooses to use it, the fee would go to the third party or the land trust. The land trust would then embark on a conservation action through either a fee simple acquisition, 70 acres, 2 pools, or through a conservation easement to be able to protect the 2 pools and the 70 acres. And so I just put it here as a reminder, the programmatic target, 2 pools, 70 acres in the rural area for each pool that's impacted in the designated development area. And then there is reporting that's done by the town to the 2 regulators, the Army Corps of Engineers and the Department of Environmental Protection. And then every year this is evaluated and reviewed to make sure that its intent is actually being played out, so that vernal pools are actually being protected at a landscape level in sacrifice for compromising them within the designated development area. And so I wanted to just remind you as well that the ordinance now allows the town to issue permits that would normally be issued by the Department of Environmental Protection. It allows us to collect fees for the impacts to the vernal pool that would then be transferred to the third party. And it allows us to establish the fee mechanism, which is what we discussed before, for an appraisal-based fee or the minimum fee. And I'll just leave this up. This is this gives you the sections of the ordinance, of the proposed ordinance, and I will allow you to ask questions about the proposed ordinance, or if Evan wants to come forward and give you another synopsis on the proposed ordinance.
I mean, some of the concerns we talked about last time that you didn't get to hear, we were concerned about having a land trust because that would put them in a position. Based on my understanding, you said part of the fee would include money to help them do what they need to do so that they're not doing all that work for nothing.
Yes, if you look on page 4, I believe it is, of the new proposed ordinance.
Yep.
I'm going to go back over here.
Oh, there we go, yep.
that the minimum fee would be established to include, in addition to acquisition costs, reasonable administrative and due diligence costs incurred by the designated third-party conservation organization to implement a mitigation project.
Okay. We're trying to figure out, again, providing some incentive for developers to actually use this.
Yes.
So I just random thought when I was looking at that, is there, you know, if you had a project that was, you know, you had 2 vernal pools, for instance, is there any hybrid approach so that, you know, you could do the 70 acres and, you know, protect 2 vernal pools? I'm just trying to figure out if there's.
Yeah, so I looked at that map that I showed you of the vernal pools within the growth area and then the rural area, and we selected parcels that we thought would be in the rural area that we thought would be really great, you know, if they could be protected. And one of them abuts already protected land at the state level, and which also is contiguous to some Orono land trust land. And so we used that as an example, and we looked at the assessed cost of that parcel and how much it would cost. So I guess the answer to your question would be that in looking at that parcel, the back acreage was only about 55 acres. But you would be getting a lot of the wetland plus the vernal pool. And then the upland area, which is still part of the habitat, is actually a little bit on that parcel, but then goes into the land that is already protected. Mm-hmm. So I believe that that would be at the programmatic level, which is what we discussed last time, because at the programmatic level, meaning you're conserving the entire habitat necessary for this vernal pool. So I would say that you could take that already conserved land into account for being at the programmatic level, and that you would be able to then acquire the 55 acres more or less. Say that we're taking about 12 acres from the upland from the already protected property, and then take a couple, 2 from another property that's all wetland and assessed at a lower value. So I think there are ways, because there's already there's protected land within the rural area, that I think you could try and use that to your benefit. I think there's ways of getting the 70 acres or the programmatic level, aside from just going out and purchasing 70 acres.
So the 70 acres wouldn't have to be a contiguous 70 acres?
It would.
It would?
Yeah.
Yes. Because
So the 55 and the 12 or whatever, and then the 2 elsewhere?
So I wish I had brought the map, but they're all contiguous, but they're on 3 separate parcels.
I see.
So if...
Contiguous to that vernal pool?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Evan, can I ask you just a quickie summary? Just mention the Black Bear Heights, the situation we ran into before, and how how the town lost potentially a good project, and what we're dealing with now in the pilot project, because she mentioned a bit of that. I asked for a summary, but this is not all over the state. This is 2 towns proposing.
Right now, pilot, yeah.
Right.
The special area management programs apply statewide.
Yeah.
But the whole effort has been to get 2 towns, Topsom and Orono, which had done this previous work, underway as pilots. So we've gotten enormous amounts of technical help from scientists and others. Mm-hmm. With respect to the Black Bear Heights, that's your question, I think you all know that Black Bear Heights was the name of a proposed subdivision off Main Street within walking distance to the schools. It was a single-family house lot subdivision. The developer had proposed, the parcel is long, it's somewhat oddly shaped, irregularly shaped, but it's long, and right through the middle of it is a wetland which includes a significant vernal pool. The developer proposed, and the local planning board, the Orono Planning Board, approved a plan that included a clustered plan that included half the proposed lots on one side of the wetland strip, that has the vernal pool in it, and then the other half to be connected with a crossing of the wetland on the back part of the land. The Army Corps of Engineers ultimately said, no, you can't do that. There's a significant vernal pool. It's embedded in a wetland, and even though you're not touching the vernal pool itself, we don't want you to touch any part of the wetland either. And they imposed that 750-foot limitation, which knocked out half of the development. And the development also ran into other difficulties along the way, and the combination of things led the project to not be able to be implemented, and it was abandoned.
I mean, my point was that that project was an example of many things we touched on in the comp plan. It was going to connect dead-end streets, the interconnectivity. It was close to utilities, close to the school. So as far as comp plan and the things we've talked about for years, that was a pretty good project. And this vernal pool, having another option, might have saved that project at the time. So that was my point here, so that you could hear that if you...
Yes, it would, and so let's just talk about that. There are no proposals for this land or anything at this point, and I don't know if there ever will be, but let's just talk about that, since you had, back in 2003, 2004, that time period, an actual project before the board, and see how that might play out under this, because it's helpful to understand.
Yep.
First of all, this was going to be a clustered project. And I want to point that out because it's discussed it's embedded in this amendment too, what happens if you're clustering. Because our clustering, above and beyond any state and federal regulations, our cluster development is all aimed at finding this balance, creating the opportunity for housing of a wide variety of types, from apartments to single-family homes, while conserving open space. And that open space includes all important natural resources. So there's a formula and all that stuff, and this town has experienced quite a few cluster developments, Darrigo Pines, the various apartment projects, and so forth. If this project, called Black Bear Heights, had come in with this in place, and if the developer had chosen to use this tool, what would have happened is that they could have gone ahead with their full proposal, which was, I think, 52 lots. They could have crossed the wetland as long as they didn't disturb more than X thousand, as long as it didn't require more. I think our ordinance has more than a Tier 1 permit from the DEP. They would not have been able to touch the vernal pool, but they weren't planning to. If you imagine, what happens is that, the development, by the way, is right in this vicinity right here. There's a line of wetland and resources that go diagonally like this, and they want to develop half of it, cross the wetland, and develop the other half as well. Probably in the wrong place here, but I think wherever Spencer is, and there's the school complex, and there's Westwood, so it's right in there. The vernal pool was over in here. They wanted to cross over in here at the narrowest part of the wetland. So they weren't going to touch the vernal pool, but the Army Corps reasoned that if you're going to disturb this wetland, you will somehow disrupt the ability of the amphibians that depend on the pool to move to their upland habitat for the rest of the season outside of the breeding season. And so they opposed that 750-foot thing. Well, what happened here, because I assume they would still be doing a cluster, I don't know that for sure, but that's what they were proposing. That vernal pool would still be protected as a vernal pool, and there would be some upland around it. It wouldn't be the 70 acres of upland around it, but there would be some. So there'd be some concern that long-term that pool could become isolated, but there would not be entirely disturbed, and there'd be some review by the board under the cluster provisions to see how best that pool might still function. But it could have moved ahead at the same time with the 52 lots instead of the 20. They were limited ultimately to 26. There would have been an appraisal done with a peer review of what that land is valued at with that limitation that they ultimately faced versus without. And so if the value of the land had gone up, you know, I don't know, let's just use a round number, $100,000, because they could now do 52 lots instead of 26 lots, they would have paid a fee to the town of $40,000. And that $40,000, that's 40% of the delta. And that $40,000 would have been transferred into a dedicated fund held by the Orno Land Trust if they were the third party, and that $40,000 would have been available for several purposes: acquisition of presumably an easement out in the rural area of the requisite lands, some funds designated for the due diligence work, surveys, environmental assessments, things you have to do when you're acquiring land, legal things, and then long-term stewardship, administrative costs. So that's how that would have worked.
Yep, thank you. Questions for Evan?
I just have a question in general that Janet touched on. If a developer is going to say, okay, we're going to just develop this area and I'm going to do the payback with the 70 acres that have 2 vernal pools in them, so they would purchase the 70-acre lot, let's say, and they would then pay 40% to the town?
No, what happens, the developer gets a choice. Either they can just, because everybody wanted to make it administratively easy for things to move ahead. That was part of the whole, you know, win-win of this. The developer would merely pay either the 40% of the delta or the minimum fee, the larger, whichever is larger, to the town for transfer to the land trust, and then they can move ahead. They can move ahead as if that vernal pool wasn't there. It's up to then the land trust to go out and find and acquire the easements for that pool in the rural area, in the land. That's one way that it can happen. The second option is the developer or somebody else, the Orono Economic Development Corporation, so if they had interest in this, could do what's called permittee, let me get the right term.
Permittee responsible mitigation.
Permittee responsible mitigation, where they, the developer, could go out and acquire that land, have their own agreement with the land trust for, you know, for the land trust, and they would have to, there'd have to be some verification that they're meeting all the criteria with that acquisition, and they'd have to demonstrate that to you, the planning board, that the what's being preserved in the rural area meets all the criteria, and the land trust would also endorse that. And then there is no fee. They don't have to pay a fee because they've paid that. They've gone out and acquired the land. There was interest in some of the developers who were involved in these long discussions, especially down in Topsom, in doing that, and so that was included as an option.
So then they would be responsible for doing the reporting back to the state and the Army Corps?
They would step into the shoes of, they would essentially provide an easement to the Orono Land Trust, and then the Orono Land Trust would become the steward of that easement. And
the administrative fees that the Orono Land Trust would have to incur would just...
They would, the land trust is used to saying, yes, we will do this, but you're going to have to give us they have a formula for a stewardship fee directly from the developer.
Okay, all right, thank you.
So based on the last meeting and what we've talked about just now, could you just elaborate if there's been any discussions? Does the land trust have any cold feet in this, or are we moving ahead?
I think we're moving ahead.
Yep. Yep.
On the record, I'm Bucky Owen, the past president of the Orono Land Trust. We were going to wait till after this meeting, actually. We have a subcommittee to deal with this. I've, again, reviewed all of this. I have some questions, particularly, I need to sit down with Evan. Our major, we have two concerns. One is the expertise to do the work, and particularly, for instance, what was the terminology you used? Where the landowner goes out and purchases.
Permittee responsible mitigation.
Okay. But then that flips over to the Vernal land trust. There's no provision in here for stewardship fees associated with that, number one. Number two, you know, when several of us go off the land trust, I'm not sure we'll have the expertise to do that. And that's why I want to talk to, I think you've all met Aram Calhoun, who's the, sort of the state expert on all of this.
Right.
And I'm actually going to get down and have her sign a chit saying that she'll continue to be an expert witness for us, so that we have the expertise to move ahead with this. I don't anticipate we're going to have a lot of these. But, and secondly is to cover our costs. And I just wrote down, you know, I just estimated, we're going to sit down and take a sample parcel of land out there and just kind of estimate what it's going to cost for appraisal, surveying, environmental survey, and all that kind of stuff, plus stewardship, to make sure that we don't want to make any money on this, but we don't want to go bankrupt. We have no paid staff at all. We're totally volunteer. But at this point, we're in. We just need to iron out the details, and particularly if you move ahead with the model ordinance, then we can sit down and really talk turkey with Evan or Jenna or whomever we need to do it. But we're behind it, we're supportive of it, and we'll do everything we can to make it work.
Thank you. Other questions? We do have some members of the audience, so if there's any initial questions, but. All right, step right up.
Good evening. My name is Chip Lake. I'm representing a landowner in the area. Couple questions. How does this compare to the in lieu fee program the state has for mitigating wetlands and middle pools?
Either one of you?
Structurally, it's a little bit similar to it, but the in lieu of mitigation fees program, in which a developer can compromise, intrude upon, alter wetlands if they get the necessary permits to do so, with mitigation in part through fees. That may or may not. The vernal pool portion of the wetlands regulation, NERPA, are stricter than wetland stuff. And so that doesn't get you out of the, probably doesn't get you out of the vernal pool limitations, restrictions of the Natural Resource Protection Act, or certainly from the Army Corps of Engineers. So this is, any developer would, if they're gonna alter wetlands, aside from the vernal pool, are still gonna have to go through the wetland. This does not relieve anybody of other regulations, including the wetland regulations. So you might still be involved with a mitigation of a wetland alteration, even if you took this option.
Right.
It's just that you wouldn't have to worry about the vernal pool portion of it.
Okay.
With the state, you'd have to deal with the town.
Yeah.
So there'd be another piece to the puzzle.
Yeah, there's always the rest of the wetland piece is still there.
Mm-hmm.
It's still NERPA, still DEP, still the Army Corps, wherever their jurisdictions come in. It's just that they would now be able to say, they would now not say, oh, and by the way, there's a vernal pool there, and not only do you have to limit yourself in terms of wetland, but gotta stay 750 feet
Right.
away from the vernal pool.
And just to clarify, the agreement is part of all the negotiation for this pilot project is that the town can be a partial reviewer? Yeah, partial.
Delegated authority from the DEP to issue the permit for
Right.
being able to compromise
But
the
just vernal
vernal
pool.
pool.
Just vernal pool.
Just the wetland, so you'd be dealing with the state, so.
Delegated authority.
Partial
Partial delegated, remember
The
that.
operative word is partial.
Yes.
Partial means for vernal pools, not for other wildlife habitat, not for other wetlands,
Right,
not for anything else governed by NERPA.
right. Does that answer your question on that one?
Normal.
Yep, you're up again.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, how would a developable lot be handled where the portion of it is in the designated development area, but another portion of it is excluded? So the developable area goes right down through the middle of a lot. So part of it would be in this program and part of it would be out because of the way these lines were
That's a good question.
configured.
How was the vernal pool overlay, I was wondering this too, how was that line established initially? Is that from the LiDAR, the aerial imaging, or not?
So we have a growth, as Jana explained, we have the designated growth area in our comprehensive plan. You know, it's a large area that basically
Go back in the.
Yeah, we have the,
covers most of this. The economic development zones around here and down through here. That's the growth area.
right,
Under the Special Area Management Program and with the reviews of the, especially Department of Inland Fish and Wildlife here in Maine, they would probably not approve all the growth area being in the designated development area for this. So they asked us, this was before Jana was on board, but they asked us, the town, to take a look at our designated growth area and say what subset of the growth area is best suited for this, thinking in terms of, you know, what might actually be developed or potential for development in the next 5 to 10 years. Does it have utility, sewer and water? Does it have access? Is it close to things? You know, where, become a little more specific. And so what you see up here in this map, the green and the red together is our designated growth area under in the comprehensive plan as approved by the state. The red are areas that are excluded from the designated development area, either because they don't have utilities and have, you know, there'd be some work to get access to them, or because they already are in conservation, such as Colburn and Preserve, and the Piney Knoll area that the land trust owns, or we know that it's got very significant other restrictions, such as that land at the end of Union Street and down toward the golf course, or is a golf course. So those things were taken out. There was no real science behind it other than our judgment, so I think this is wide open to discussion and modification. This is a draft. It was, we did it as a draft.
right.
To Chip's question, if a property is divided, then that part of the land that's not in the designated development area, if there's a vernal pool there, would not be eligible for this alternative regulation. If it's within the designated development area, part of the lot, then it would be eligible for participation in this alternative regulation. And it's not always, it's, you know, we try not to cut lots, properties, because it just makes it complicated. It'd have to be a very large lot or something with other restrictions. So I think, you know, at the staff level, we're wide open to comment, review, and modification of some of these lines.
Okay, as I was wondering if there was other properties similar to Chip's comment there that may be
There are
negotiable.
a couple, there are
Yeah.
a few properties that fall in that situation, but just a few.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, that pretty much answers what I had, just for planning purposes. It would make sense if either another lot or the whole lot was included.
Okay, just out of curiosity, for this, when would that occur? So we're talking about the ordinance tonight, if we made a recommendation for council, but those kinds of adjustments, when would that
Yeah,
occur?
it really should be happening now, you know, in this time frame. This map, it becomes part of the zoning ordinance. You know, it becomes an overlay district. It is the boundaries of the overlay district, so it's part of the ordinance, and it's part, potentially what you might want to recommend to the council, one way or another, either the map as is or with alterations. The council itself could alter it before they put it to their public hearing as well. So, you know, but we're in that time frame. The next 30 days, we want to finalize the map so that either with direction from you today as part of your recommendation that it should be modified, or the council when they take it up.
Right, I was just thinking about, because I would not have been aware of this issue unless he brought it up, but if there were other properties, would you alert them that, you know, that a line might be going through their lots? I'm just trying to figure out how to avoid this, you know, to resolve an issue. Here, we have one lot owner that showed up tonight, but if there's others, it'd be nice to try to get it right the first time?
I think it might just be one large parcel that's
Okay,
divided, and it's an
Okay.
area where, sewer water is limited, but, there may be, the line that was drawn was just kind of a judgment call. There wasn't anything.
okay. All right,
So if you wanted, for example, as part of your recommendation, if you felt this way, and I certainly wouldn't argue with it, to say that we should examine lines to see the degree to which, if there's a strong logic behind dividing a parcel in
Right.
partly in and partly out of the designated development area, we could work with property owners, the council, whoever, to,
right. I think that would be probably a must. We
That's
we
entirely
have
up
somebody
to you.
from the public here this evening, and I wouldn't have thought of that issue, so. Did we answer your questions? Very good. Any other questions? All right. Other comments from the board? The ordinance, we didn't get right in the thick of this. It was an overview last time, we had a lot of good discussion. It's good to have the land trust here. And tonight, we have a couple people from the audience, but we still have the monster ordinance in front of us. So what I asked last time is if you had a chance to review that prior to the meeting. I'm just thinking procedurally. So if we have no questions, this is what's in front of us. I think the red text that you added here is helpful. That clarifies how the land trust would be covered. But how would the board like to proceed now? Because there's a lot of new text. Jana did a great job in summarizing last time in the abbreviated version now, but has the board had a chance to review the proposed text? Would you like to go through things line by line, or how do you want to proceed?
I reviewed it. Obviously a lot of the finer points, I wouldn't have come up with your question either. So I guess I'm game to do what others think would be best.
Okay.
I still have a concern about the land trust and it being a volunteer organization, and I don't know when we should have that discussion, but
Right.
I have that concern.
I agree, just for your purpose, you heard Mr. Owen mention that, but they have a guarantee, because our comment last time was a pretty good burden was being put on the land trust as part of this pilot project, and making sure that they had the expertise to select, if they were being tasked with finding areas to mitigate or negotiating that, or whatever the case may be, that they had the expertise in-house. So they received a guarantee from Ron Calhoun, who's the guru of vernal pools in this area, that she would always support them, till eternity, apparently. So that was a concern. You listen to, land trust comment about that as well. So,
But if I understand it, the burden still remains on the town. The burden is still on the, if I read this correctly,
Yep.
even if the land trust backs away, is the burden still not on the town in DEP's eyes? It sounds like it is.
yep.
Jana, may I?
Sure.
Okay. The burden to, according to the SAMP, the Special Area Management Program, the burden, once the town has reached an agreement with a third-party conservation organization, it is the responsibility of that third party to find the land, if they possibly can, to acquire and do everything necessary to acquire it. If they decide they're not going to do it, then this goes inactive. The only way this can happen is if there's a third-party agreement with who is comfortable enough with the program to sign on with the town. They don't have to sign on with the town. They can say, we just don't think we can do it. And so we've done, some due diligence work with the Orono Land Trust, talked to their board, met a couple times with their committees to find out their comfort level. And, we think we're getting close, and we're trying to get language in here to make sure that they will be appropriately covered. And then, but in the end, there's nothing that says they have to do this.
That's why I was wondering if at some point, so that it's written that third party will participate, but if at some point, if something happens or wrong and the land trust does not have the capability to do this, that they could back off if
They're
they're
in the
not.
agreement, they're in the model agreement that's been
Yeah.
put together, there's a termination clause. If that happens and the town cannot find a qualified third-party organization to step in their place, then this overlay district is dormant
All right, so that would protect.
Until one is found.
until one is
Right.
found and we,
Okay.
you know, it is deemed qualified and a new agreement is struck.
Yeah, because the developer also has the opportunity to do it on his own, so.
Yes, but they would also have to have a third party with whom to have an agreement.
And
But
what,
that might be easier too, because they'd be very specific and they could arrange their own deal with the developer, so that's a good point.
There's also a clause within this whole thing that the money, if it's not used over time, goes to a greater fund at the state level to be used for conserving natural resources, not strictly just vernal pools, but there is a fund at the state level that does conserve vernal pools, vernal pool habitat, and other types of natural resources at the landscape level. So I believe it's 3 years. 3 years. If the money isn't used in 3 years, it can then be transferred to that fund. So there is some contingency if, you know, if the land trust is on board, and they can't find a conservation project within 3 years, there is a contingency. If the land trust pulls away, and there's still this fund, this money that's still left in the fund, that can then go to this other fund. So there are contingencies in place to ensure that natural resources are still being protected at a landscape level, regardless of, you know, if they're being executed by the third party or by the town, so.
and if that happens, does that state fund become the steward for the properties that have already been put into this tool?
No.
No,
Presume this is MNRCP,
yes.
Yes.
which we have utilized. We have several projects that
Sorry.
have been funded. I'm sorry.
Well, just on the record, if you would, I don't mind you commenting,
Yeah.
this is a good discussion, but can we just get you on the record so that we have all this recorded, please?
Ray Owen again, Bucky Owen. We have applied to this fund several times. It's called the Maine Natural Resources Protection Program, and it's money that's allocated regionally throughout the state. They try to match the wetlands that are being protected with the wetlands that have been destroyed, and it has a third party associated with that, but actually there's no reporting requirement by that third party on an annual basis that there is with this program.
Right, and I was just wondering what would happen with the reporting. Does that stop too if it doesn't? So who's responsible for it?
So that would stay with the town.
The town has to do some reporting anyways, and we would end up taking that over, but in terms of the easement will still be in place. You know, because this moves way beyond ordinances, and now we're into real estate law. And if landowner X has sold an easement to conservation organization Y, that easement is in place. That easement is in place. Now, if for some reason the land trust went defunct or something like that, there would have to be a proceeding where that conservation easement would be transferred to another responsible party, because that still remains a restriction on that land. And under the SAMP, the town has some responsibility for making sure that the property is not being violated. But that, in the first instance, that would be the land trust as the easement holder. There would be that responsibility, and hopefully there'd be some funds as part of this available to them to carry out that responsibility.
And the last time we talked about if a parcel, the mitigation piece wasn't available in town, that they could go to neighboring communities. Would there be difficulty with a third party, the Orno Land Trust, in dealing with potential, and again, this may never happen, but potential parcels that aren't in town? I wondered what limitation, okay, you can, okay. Just random occurrences, but I'm just curious. All right. Other questions? All right, okay, we didn't finish the discussion. I mean, we got line by line, you read it thoroughly. Dave, what are our thoughts on proceeding with what we have before us. I think we've heard quite a bit of information, we've got a little bit of public input, but I think we might be close enough that we could proceed. We gotta know how we're gonna get through this. What are your thoughts, Jeremy, Dave? What do you wanna do?
I'm comfortable with what I've read. It
Yeah.
seems
Likewise.
like a low risk, high reward. So,
Okay,
Yeah, it's a good program, and I think we need to recommend it to the council.
I agree.
right.
I'm on board with it.
Do we need to go through line by line? I've given you, we've had two months to review this. I think we've addressed some of the significant concerns.
Right.
I've heard from the land trust, that was a big one for me, but I'm a little bit more comfortable knowing that they could actually pull
Right.
back if they were not well equipped to deal with their role.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just point out, and I pointed out before, so I'm sure you're aware of it, but I just want to underscore that this is creating the overlay district, but it's amending a few other parts of the ordinance too.
Yes.
So that the things mesh nicely with the new overlay district. And one of those deals with the wildlife standards of the ordinance, where we become more specific about inventorying vernal pools, and if you're not taking advantage of this program, of this option, that you're giving protection to those vernal pools specifically. Any vernal pool. And so that's there. And then there are tweaks to the submission requirements for the site plan or subdivision review, so that the information you need to review those plans with respect to this alternative option would be there if the developer goes that route.
Okay. Just a quick question, because Topsom and Orono are participating in this. How far along is Topsom?
Topsom has adopted their ordinance. I think they've reached a third-party agreement with the Brunswick Topsom Land Trust.
Okay.
And they're in the process of applying for partial delegation to the DEP. I believe that's the last I heard.
Yes.
I'm assuming that we've kept abreast of their process, or any lessons learned, because they're farther along than we are at this point.
Right, we've got all their documents,
Yeah.
and we're in communication with them, and yes.
Okay.
And
We
both
have-
Ron Calhoun and Elizabeth Hertz, who is helping. I'm not sure who she's a consultant to, if it's to the university. I guess she's part of the university team. But she's an expert in wetlands regulation, among other things. And so she's also serving as a communications link, letting us know how Topsom is doing. And
Good. That's what I would hope, because they're farther along. Any last questions from the public before I close the public hearing? Going once, twice. All right, further discussion. I mean, if we're okay with this as is, I didn't have any substantive changes. I just wanted to address some of the
I
things.
think if we make a recommendation to approve this, I think that we should put the one stipulation or requirement on it that lots not be divided, because it could be complicated for us in the future to figure out if a vernal pool is on one side of the line or the other side of the line, if it's a divided lot.
Right.
How do we word that?
No, I agree with you. I would like to recommend, I think it's very important that planning staff take, a closer look at that line and just see. We've heard from one property owner, Evan thought it might just be the one lot, but let's try to nail that down as part of the process, so that that this board isn't put into a spot, and the town isn't as well. Do other people agree with that?
Yeah, and just to make sure I'm clear on this, that was because the lot, part of it was in the developmental zone and part of it wasn't, right? And so that if you're not in that developmental zone, then you're not covered by this thing. Okay.
Exactly.
So we just have to be aware that if there are lots like that, we have to mitigate that somehow.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. Any other changes to what we've had? That was a big concern. It's very nice that a member of the public brought that up, because I would not have
Thank you.
would not have caught that. So. All right then. So I think we are ready for a motion. If somebody wants to take a stab at our addition, by all means, jump in.
I guess I make a motion that we accept the proposal as is, with the stipulation that properties not be defined such that they're split between districts. So a property would be either in a district or not in the district. So it will be, you know, less confusing for us as we review applications.
That capture it?
Yeah, maybe we might want to clarify the difference between one that's in the developmental zone and one that isn't, because that isn't covered by this anyway, right? What
All
you
right,
said.
well, I'm just thinking,
Yeah.
so that, as Evan explained it before, so as long as that line that the town closely reviews, and I guess in discussion with property owners, because we have one that's at the table now, and maybe it's just the one lot, that they're involved in a discussion and establishing where that line goes, so.
Correct.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. So I think, Jeremy, I think that captured it, plus meeting minutes. I think you get the gist of what we're trying to send on to council, right? Any questions? Or is that clear?
I think it's clear enough. So just within the designated lots that are split by the designated development area would be further reviewed to ensure that the entire lot is placed within the designated development area.
Within or without, whatever makes
Yeah.
sense.
Within or
Right.
without,
No,
sure.
that's
And
correct.
I guess in consultation with the property owners.
With the-
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. So if that's clear, we do have.
That's exactly what I
Yeah,
proposed.
so there we go. You gotta read between the lines there. Yeah, so we have a motion.
I'll second.
Very good. Any further discussion? I guess all those in favor? All right. Thank you. That was very good discussion of the issue, and we'll see what the council comes up with. Next up is a discussion, informal presentation on updating the zoning map, and I see no action, so are we putting that off? Is that what we're?
Nope, we can just talk about it briefly, and I forgot to include the draft zoning map in your packet, so I apologize for that.
Yep.
I can put it up on the,
Let's do that.
okay,
I do want to thank
sorry.
Mr. Owen, I do want to thank the Land Trust participation in this process. It's a unique thing to be able to participate, and your involvement is greatly appreciated.
A little bit scared. Thank you.
Have a good evening.
So, again, I apologize that I didn't include a larger scale map of this in your packet, but we presented, they're not substantive changes to the zoning map. They were, the council took some action on some contract zones since 2011, and the last time that the map was amended was in 2011. And so there were several contract zones that were included on this map. Another update to the map was, so you'll notice that the shoreland zoning overlay is no longer on this map. We now have two maps. One would be the townwide zoning map, and the other would be the shoreland overlay map, which I can put up after this one, but I want to speak to this one first. So what was happening is what was supposed to be an overlay zone was actually embedded as a townwide zone on the zoning map as it's shown now. And that caused some issues because we weren't sure exactly what the underlying zone was. It wasn't showing up on the map. So for example, down by the Penobscot River and the MDR, there was the shoreland zoning buffer from the Penobscot River, but underneath it wasn't showing that it was the MDR district. So there was some confusion. If you were a member of the public and you were looking at our zoning map, you would realize that you were within the limited residential shoreline overlay, but you didn't also know that you were in the medium density residential zone as well. So what this does is it pulls the underlying zone throughout the entire parcel boundary. And then we have another shoreline zoning map to be able to show that you are within the underlying zone, and then you're also within this shoreline zoning overlay. So that was one of the largest updates that was made to the map, in addition to the contract zones that were added that had been approved by the council since 2011.
How many contracts, I'm just trying to recall.
Let me see, there were 3 contract zones.
Do they have a particular color up there?
Yes. Well, so what we did was we created an inset, which is on your bottom right. That bottom right inset is strictly contract and conditional zones, which we think makes it a lot easier to see where they are throughout the town. What we also did was we gave them each a number, and that number then reflects to the ID in that table in the middle of the map. And you go number by number, and you're able to see the lot, the tax map, and lot. You're able to see what the contract zone is. You're able to see the date that it was adopted by the council, and you're also able to see the address of the contract zone and the zone that it was, the contract zone that it's in.
So in essence, this isn't really a zoning change, it's just a clarification of what already
It's
exists.
updates,
Right.
yes, exactly. Updates to the map that needed to happen for housekeeping purposes, to show it the way that it should be represented at this point in time. I can show you. Oh, yes. Sorry about that. The council also approved the extension of the village commercial district down Forest Avenue to include 4 lots? 5 lots. Down to the chiropractic office, and that was approved, I don't know.
4 or 5 meetings ago, yeah.
Yep, and so this is reflective of that as well, that change as well.
So people can see this on the town's GIS viewer, so it's a little
It
clearer?
has not been formally adopted yet.
Okay.
We just wanted to show it to you because this is going to affect you as well, and once it has been adopted, we will certainly, I think for the next meeting, which by the way, we don't have anything on the January agenda at this point, but I can certainly provide this map to you so you can look at it in more detail. And going forward, once it becomes adopted by the council, we will give you the approved copy of the map.
So you could email a copy to us?
Yes,
Good.
certainly. And we also can print you copies
It
as
might be
many.
nice to have one on the wall.
Yeah, so when it becomes adopted, we will put it up in the community development office as well as my office, and you're welcome to suggest places throughout town hall that we could put it. Certainly it will be incorporated into the GIS online when it becomes formalized. I'll quickly just show you the shoreland zoning overlay. If I can. They're large documents and they don't like to download sometimes. There we go. So the rest of the underlying zones are taken out of this so that it's clear that this is strictly an overlay map for shoreline zoning. What was happening also on our map was that because we have aquifer overlay, we have a still water overlay, there's several other overlays, and the Main Street overlay now, and then potentially the Vernal Pool overlay. So with all those other overlays and then a shoreline overlay on top of it, there's only so many colors you can use until everything looks brown or purple. You know, it really all just kind of merges together. So this was just easier for members of the public, residents, town staff. board members, counselors, to be able to look at this and really have more clarity to where the shoreland zoning is and where the townwide zoning is.
Looks
So,
good.
Yeah. I think that was, any questions, any comments? We can provide this to you, and you can provide comments to us as well. Gone through several reiterations, so we're hoping that it goes well. But so basically, this was brought to the comp plan implementation committee at council level. They looked at it earlier this month. It is on the agenda for the next comp plan implementation meeting, and then hopefully there will be some discussion on putting it on the council agenda.
Just out of curiosity, the implementation committee, that's just a subcommittee of the council itself?
Yes.
Any other public members? No, I didn't think so. Yeah. All right, so nothing is up for, unless there's further questions, we don't anticipate a January meeting?
That's correct.
All right, anything on the horizon?
Some small, maybe amendment to a subdivision, maybe a group development, which could be really exciting. So, that's all I've heard.
Okay,
Maybe disc golf once the snow
Yes,
melts.
yeah, they've been putting a lot of work in over there.
They have been.
Yeah. Well, very good, thank you very much, that looks good. Any further comments, discussion? Last up is adjournment.
I move we adjourn.
All
Seconded.
right, very good. All those in favor? Everyone have a great holiday.
Yep.
And have a good month off.